I had always enjoyed the peacefulness of being home alone. It was a rare moment of solitude in my otherwise very busy life. However, tonight was different. I felt a strange feeling in the air, a feeling of being watched that sent chills down my spine. I decided to ignore my irrational fears and distract myself with a movie. But as soon as I settled into my bed, I noticed a man standing at my bedroom window. His face was obscured by shadows, but I could see his creepy smile with missing teeth and hear him tapping his mangled hand on the glass. I froze in fear, unsure of what to do. The man just stood there, staring at me with his eerie grin. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for me. Suddenly, I heard the handle of my front door being rattled. My heart was pounding in my chest as I realized that this man was now trying to break in. He started slamming and shouting, demanding that I let him in at once. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. I could hear his voice getting louder and more aggressive as he continued to slam and rattle the door handle. It sounded like he was trying to break the door down. I knew I had to do something, but I was too scared to move. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that this was just a bad dream, but the man's voice was all too real and too terrifying to be just a dream. Finally, I found the courage to call the police. I told them everything that was happening, and they promised to send a car over immediately. I waited, huddled in my bed, trying to keep quiet so the man wouldn't hear me. The seconds felt like hours as I listened to him continue to slam on my front door, when finally I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, and I heard the man's footsteps as he ran away, but I was still too scared to even look out of the window. It must have been a neighbour, because the police arrived shortly after and then took my statement. They told me that they would do everything they could to find the man, and that I should just stay with a friend for the rest of the night if I wanted to feel safe. I never found out who that man was, or why he was trying to break into my house, but I could never forget that creepy smile and the missing teeth, and that mangled hand tapping on my window, and the terrifying voice shouting to be let in. It was all just too much. From that day on, I always made sure to double check that all of my doors and windows were locked before going to bed, and I still do it to this day. But to be honest, I've never felt safe being home alone, ever again. I never thought much about being home alone until that night. I mean, I was a brave kid, and it was never something that I was too afraid of. But on this particular day, my parents were out of town, and for some reason, it felt different. But like I said, I'd been home alone many times before, so I'm not sure why on this particular night I had a sense that something was off. I remember I was lounging on the couch, scrolling through my phone, when I suddenly heard a noise coming from the living room. I walked out my bedroom and I looked up to see a man sitting there with his head fixed on the TV and his hands on his head. He was rocking back and forth and talking to himself, completely absorbed in his own world. I was startled and didn't know what to do. I slowly approached him, trying not to startle him. But as soon as he saw me, he jumped up and ran towards me, his eyes wild and his face contorted with fear. He begged me to help him, tears streaming down his face. He was clearly in distress, and I didn't know what to do. I promised him that I would help, that I would call for help, and that everything would be all right. I quickly dialed 911 and explained the situation. The operator told me to stay on the line and to keep the man calm, if possible. I talked to him, trying to distract him from his fear and anxiety, but he just kept repeating the same thing over and over again, saying that he was being followed and that they were after him. Finally, I heard the sounds of sirens in the distance, and I breathed a sigh of relief. The police arrived shortly after, and they took the man away. They explained to me that he was mentally ill and had wandered away from the nearby mental hospital, and I wasn't too shocked, to be honest. I was shaken by the whole experience. I had never encountered someone with such severe mental illness before, and it was scary to see how vulnerable and scared he was. I realised how important it was to be aware of those around us and to look out for those who might need help, and to never take our own mental health for granted. But from that day on, I always made sure to lock all of the doors and windows before going to bed. It was a typical Friday night. My parents had gone out for their dinner date, which allowed me to have a little bit of alone time, which I craved. I was snuggled up in my bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a noise outside. I peeked out my window and saw my neighbour, Mr. Wilson, in my backyard. I found it odd that he would be in my backyard, so I put on a robe and went outside to see what he wanted. As I approached him, I noticed that he had a strange look on his face. He asked me if I was home alone, and I hesitated before answering. I didn't want to lie, but I also didn't want to tell him the truth. He could tell that I was lying, and asked me why I wasn't being honest. I started to feel uneasy, so I begged him to just leave. But instead, he just smiled and started to approach me. His slow walk quickly turned into a sprint, and he lunged at the back door. I quickly locked it, and he banged on it a few times before finally laughing and walking away. I was left standing there, wondering what the hell just happened. When my parents came home, I told them everything. They didn't believe me and thought I was just imagining things, but after pleading for hours, they eventually called up our neighbour to ask him why he was in our garden. The next day, Mr. Wilson came over to talk to my parents directly, insisting that he was just looking for his lost dog, and that I had made the rest of the story up. But I knew what I had seen and felt that night. I knew that something was off about Mr. Wilson. I never saw him in my backyard again, but every now and then I'd see him getting into his car and we'd sometimes lock eyes. He'd always just smile and pretend that there was nothing wrong. All I can say is, I can't wait until I'm old enough to move out. It was a quiet night, and I was home alone watching Netflix when I heard a loud banging on my front door. I cautiously approached the door and peered through the peephole. This is when I saw several police officers with their guns drawn, shouting at me to open the door. I was terrified and had no idea what was going on. I opened the door and the officers stormed in, searching my room from top to bottom. They were looking for drugs and kept insisting that they had received a call that this house was a drug den. I tried to tell them that they had the wrong house, but they didn't believe me. They handcuffed me and took me to the police station, where I was questioned for hours. They kept accusing me of being a drug dealer and wanted me to confess. But I had nothing to confess. I'd never even done a drug, let alone dealt one. I was just a regular teenage boy trying to enjoy a quiet night at home. But after hours of interrogation, they finally realised that they had the wrong house. They apologised for the mistake and released me. But even though they were at fault, they treated me like a criminal. They made me feel like I had done something wrong when I hadn't. It was a terrifying experience, one that left me traumatised for years. Every time I hear a loud noise or see a police car, I have flashbacks of that night. I can never seem to shake the feeling of being falsely accused, and it really has made me lose faith in the justice system. I guess I was let off in the end, but I felt like it very easily could have gone the other way. It really does seem that even if you're innocent in some cases, the system can still make you feel like a criminal, and that is the scariest thing of all. I was alone in my house on a dark and stormy night. The wind was howling outside and the rain was pounding on the roof. As I usually did, I was watching TV in my living room when suddenly I heard a loud bang coming from my garden. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to investigate. I went outside and saw a firework lying on the ground, still smouldering. I looked around and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response. But then I heard the back door slam shut suddenly. I rushed over to the door and tried to open it, but it was already locked. I could feel the panic starting to set in as I realized that someone was in my house. I peered through the window and saw the back of a tall man disappearing into the darkness of my home. I didn't have my phone with me, so I decided to climb over the fence and bang on my neighbour's back door, hoping that someone was home. As I pounded on that door, I noticed that the lights were off and nobody seemed to be home. My heart sank as I realized that I was truly alone and in danger. I started to panic, not knowing what to do. I heard a loud creaking noise coming from my house. I turned around and peered over the fence and saw the back door slowly opening. Fear crept up my spine as I saw the tall man stepping out of the darkness, his face hidden in the shadows. He started to approach me, step by step, his breaths heavy and ragged. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or even scream. Just as he was about to reach me, the sky lit up with a bright flash of lightning, and in that instant I saw the man's face twisted in a terrifying snarl. I could see the madness in his eyes and the bloodlust in his expression. I knew that I was about to die in this moment. But then, just as quickly as it had come, the lightning disappeared, leaving behind only darkness and the sound of the storm. When I opened my eyes again, the man was gone, and I was left standing alone in my neighbour's backyard. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted. The memory of that terrifying night stayed with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the dangers that can lurk in the darkness. I had been stuck in my house for days due to an intense snowstorm that had made it impossible for my family to come home. At first, I enjoyed the peace and quiet, snuggled up in blankets with hot cocoa and a good book. But as the nights wore on, a growing sense of unease settled into the pit of my stomach. It started with the small things, like the creaking of the old wooden floorboards and the flickering of the lights. But soon, I began to hear strange noises in the middle of the night, scratching and tapping on the windows, as if someone or something was trying to get inside. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just the wind or an overactive imagination. But the fear wouldn't go away, and then one night, as I was lying in bed, I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the house. I froze, heart pounding in my chest as the growl grew louder and closer. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could feel a presence looming over me, watching me with malevolent intent. I tried to scream, but my voice caught in my throat as a cold, bony hand wrapped around my ankle, dragging me out of bed and towards the open window. I fought and kicked, but the grip on my ankle only tightened, pulling me closer and closer to the edge. But just when I thought it was all over, a bright light flooded the room, revealing my parents standing in the doorway, with concerned looks on their faces. The hand released its grip, and I collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My parents explained that they had finally been able to make it home and had seen strange footprints leading up to the house. They had found the window open and had rushed inside to make sure I was okay. I don't know what would have happened if they hadn't come home when they did, but I never want to be alone in that house again. Something evil had been lurking in the shadows, and I just knew it was waiting for another chance to strike. I think I was about 13 at the time. I was home alone, sitting on the couch in my living room, scrolling through my phone, just waiting for my parents to come home. It was already late, and I was starting to get a bit bored, and that's when I heard it. A faint whisper that seemed to be coming from the attic. I froze, unsure of what to do. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the whisper persisted. It sounded like a woman's voice, asking for something. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but the tone of her voice was urgent. I cautiously made my way to the bottom of the attic stairs and looked up. The door was closed, but I could hear the whispering much more clearly now. I hesitated for a moment before slowly climbing the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. As I reached the top of the stairs, the whispering stopped. I pushed the door open, and that's when I saw her. The woman in the attic. She was sitting on an old wooden chest, her crazy hair and eyes looking as if they were rolling to the back of her head. She was wearing a dirty pair of jeans and a loose rag for a shirt. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to sound as calm as possible when inside I was screaming. She looked up at me, and her eyes locked onto mine. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need some supplies. I've been up here for days, and I'm running out of food and water." I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to give her anything, but at the same time, I didn't want to leave her up there to starve. I felt bad for her. I told her I would be right back and went down to the kitchen. I was caught in two minds. Did I call the police? Did I call my parents? Or did I go and get her some supplies to help her? While I was trying to make up my mind, I heard a loud thump coming from the attic. I raced back upstairs, and when I opened the door, the woman was now standing right in front of me, her eyes now even wider and her hair standing on end. I backed away, and she took a step forward. "Thank you," she said, her voice sounding almost normal at this point. "You've been very kind." And then, without warning, she lunged at me. I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose board on the floor. As I fell, I heard her laugh, a high-pitched, maniacal sound that chilled me to the bone. I scrambled to my feet and ran out of the house, screaming for help. Eventually, one of my neighbours phoned the police, and when they arrived, they found that woman still in my house, and still in the attic. She had been living there for weeks, surviving on scraps of food and water that she had managed to scavenge. The woman was taken away, and my parents came home to find me shaken, but luckily unharmed. A few weeks later, we moved out of that house, but I never forgot about the woman in the attic. To this day, I can still hear her whispers in my dreams. I was home alone for the first time in ages, and while I was quite excited at first, as night fell, a creeping sense of unease began to take over. The house was completely silent, except for the occasional creak or groan, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything around me. I decided to watch some TV to take my mind off things, but as I sat there, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The shadows around me seemed to shift and move, and every time I looked up, I swore I saw something out of the corner of my eye. I tried to ignore it and focus on the TV, but then I heard a shuffling sound coming from the back of the house. It was soft at first, but it quickly grew louder and more distinct. My heart began to race as I realized that someone was in my house. I reached for my phone to call the police, but my hands were shaking so badly that I accidentally dropped it. I was about to get up and run for the back door when I realised, to my horror, that I had left it unlocked. I could feel the cold sweat starting to form on my forehead as I tiptoed towards the door, my hand reaching for the lock. But just as I was about to turn it, I heard a loud crash coming from the living room. I froze, not knowing what to do next. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadowy figure dart across the room. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see that it was holding something in its hand. I knew that I had to get out of there, so I grabbed a torch from the kitchen and ran towards the back door. But as I reached for the handle, I saw my own reflection in the mirror on the wall. I stopped dead in my tracks as I realised that the figure I had seen in the living room was me, reflected in the glass. I had been so terrified that I had imagined everything, and the shuffling sound had been nothing more than just the house settling as it always did. I felt foolish but relieved at the same time. I knew that I couldn't let my fear control me, so I took a deep breath, locked the back door and went back to the living room to watch TV, with the torch in my hand just in case. But that feeling of unease didn't leave me until weeks later. Maybe everything I saw was just my reflection, but there's still a small part of me that isn't so sure. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.